They were no ordinary instruments of war in less than 2 years. The Einsatzgruppen had cleansed more than 1 million lives, not in gas chambers, but out in open fields, on roads, and in forests, day after day. The commanders of those massacres were not combat soldiers, but doctors of law, economists, and renowned scholars, men who turned death into a cold administrative procedure. When the banner of victory was lowered, justice began to hunt them down one by one. They stood before the Nuremberg tribunal. But after the horrific verdict, what awaited the architects of that tragedy? Would the price they paid be as neat as a just sentence? Or would it bear the stamp of a punishment even more ruthless than the horror they had sown? Let us open the darkest pages of the Second World War, where justice and atrocity faced off in their final confrontation. Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination units of Nazi Germany, were established in 1939 by directive of Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler and his deputy Reinhard Heydrich, signaling a deliberate escalation from isolated acts of terror and discrimination to an organized, industrial-scale campaign of mass murder. Unlike the static apparatus of concentration camps, these units operated at the front lines, marching in the wake of Wehrmacht advances to eliminate any group deemed undesirable Jewish communities, Soviet political commissars, Roma populations, persons with disabilities, prisoners of war, and civilian hostages alike. What made Einsatzgruppen particularly insidious was not merely their mobility, but the pedigree of their leaders. Rather than career soldiers, they were led by highly educated professionals, doctors of law, economists and university scholars whose academic credentials lent a veneer of bureaucratic legitimacy to what was nothing short of systematic slaughter. Upon arrival in a newly occupied town, an Einsatz commando would swiftly establish a headquarters offices staffed with clerks, communication lines set up with field headquarters, and logistical support coordinated down to the last detail of transportation, ammunition supply, and grave digging schedules. These death factories on wheels functioned with corporate efficiency. Targets were identified through local police networks or coerced lists produced by municipal officials. Victims were gathered under false pretenses of relocation or registration, and operations proceeded according to prearranged timetables. Reports of monthly progress were compiled, tallying lives extinguished with the same precision as any industrial output metric. Within less than 2 years, Einsatzgruppen claimed over 1 million lives, an achievement of horror made possible only through the fusion of extremist ideology and ruthless administrative acumen. As the Eastern Front collapsed under the weight of Soviet counteroffensives, many high-ranking officers of Einsatzgruppen attempted to vanish into the remnants of the collapsing Third Reich, banking on the chaos of retreat to shield them from accountability. Yet their meticulously kept records, detailed action reports, signed orders, and photographic documentation survived the war. Forming the backbone of the Allied legal response, in May of 1945, following Germany's formal surrender, Allied prosecutors obtained these archives and prepared to turn them into evidence of crimes against humanity. The subsequent Nuremberg proceedings and follow-up trials marked a watershed moment in international law. For the first time, the concept of genocide would be prosecuted not as an incidental byproduct of war, but as a deliberate, state-sanctioned policy. Einsatzgruppen commanders were charged with orchestrating mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Their scholarly titles and administrative talents held up as proof that they fully understood the criminal nature of their tasks. The tribunal's rejection of superior orders as a valid defense established that intellectual sophistication and legal training did not absolve one of moral responsibility. By autumn of 1947, dozens of Einsatzgruppen officers stood in the dock, forced to confront the consequences of a regime that had turned death into an assembly line process. Though some sentences were later commuted under Cold War political pressures, the trials cemented the principle that individual accountability could transcend national boundaries and wartime exigencies. The legacy of those proceedings endures in modern conventions against genocide and crimes against humanity, a legal framework designed to prevent any future mobilization of learned elites toward the machinery of mass extermination, organized into four main groups designated A, B, C, and D. The Einsatzgruppen divided their grim mission across vast territories. Group A moved through the three Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Group B operated in Belarus and central Russia. Group C advanced into northern and central Ukraine. And Group D swept across southern Ukraine, Crimea, and the Caucasus regions. Each of these main divisions was further subdivided into independent detachments, Sonderkommandos and Einsatzkommandos, capable of rapid action, equipped with mobile communication networks, motor vehicles, logistical support units, and personnel contingents allocated. These detachments functioned with the autonomy of a military task force. What set these units apart was the intellectual caliber of their leaders rather than conventional military experience. Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, a jurist with a doctorate in law, commanded Group D with unflinching resolve. Walter Stahlecker, a former police director and seasoned diplomat, directed Group A with bureaucratic finesse. Their legal training and administrative background lent a chilling efficiency to the operations. They treated mass murder as a project, coordinating the flow of orders and resources through a chain of command that resembled a business enterprise more than a battlefield structure. Under their direction, the genocidal process was optimized into a cold administrative procedure. Personnel assignments were meticulously planned. Dossiers on designated targets were compiled and continuously updated. Execution tallies were recorded in detailed registers. Ammunition inventories were tracked with industrial rigor. Even post-operation gatherings, celebratory meetings, framed as morale events, were scheduled to maintain esprit de corps and reinforce ideological commitment. This formal, methodical approach transformed the act of extermination into a series of logistical tasks executed with corporate discipline. To extend their reach and conserve the Einsatzgruppen's core manpower, local auxiliaries were systematically recruited. Auxiliary police units and civilian volunteers, motivated by ingrained anti-Semitic sentiment or the desire to align with occupying forces, provided crucial intelligence and manpower for arrests and roundups. These auxiliaries, familiar with local terrain, language, and community networks, amplified the Einsatzgruppen's effectiveness, enabling swift identification, isolation, and removal of victims. The collaboration with local collaborators also created a veneer of consensual participation, further obscuring the true nature of the operations. Close coordination with the Wehrmacht and civilian occupation authorities cemented this partnership. Military commands provided escort and security details, ensuring that executions proceeded without interference from partisans or civilian protests. Occupation administrators issued decrees branding the actions as security measures or anti-partisan operations, offering a juridical cover that masked the genocide as legitimate state policy. Intelligence gathered from military reconnaissance and local informants guided Einsatzgruppen movements and enhanced their tactical planning. This scale of organization and networked cooperation allowed the Einsatzgruppen to operate with speed and efficiency. Every operational theater adhered to standardized procedures, establishment of a command post, compilation of victim lists, execution protocols, record keeping, and communication with higher headquarters. By embedding their atrocities within the frameworks of both military and civilian administration, they ensured that the machinery of death functioned smoothly, shielded from outside scrutiny and underpinned by the authority of the Nazi state. Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 marked the pinnacle of Einsatzgruppen activity. At the Freytag Conference, Reinhard Heydrich issued a criminal order to annihilate every Jew, Soviet political commissar, Roma individual, person with disabilities, and any civilian deemed undesirable, placing these actions entirely outside the bounds of international law. Upon seizing a newly occupied town, an Einsatzkommando would coerce the local administration into providing lists of Jewish residents under the pretext of resettlement registration. Victims were assembled in a central location. There, they were ordered to disrobe and stand at the edge of pre-dug mass graves. Each person was shot at close range, their bodies falling in layers into the pit. This method, coldly nicknamed sardine packing, maximized efficiency by minimizing the time and labor required to prepare burial sites. Witnesses described the eerie silence as columns of men, women, and children, often hand in hand, advanced toward the graves. For each group, the only sound was the staccato rhythm of rifle fire ending in finality. These executions became the most harrowing symbol of the mobile Holocaust in the field. The results were staggering. Within 6 months of the invasion's launch, Group A reported the murder of 229,052 Jews in the Baltic region. Meanwhile, Group D recorded 91,678 executions in southern Ukraine and Crimea. Perhaps the most notorious example was the Babyn Yar massacre, where 33,771 Ukrainian Jews were slaughtered in just 2 days. The systematic application of these tactics revealed a terrifying calculus by standardizing and bureaucratizing killing. The Einsatzgruppen transformed genocide into a form of mass production. Commanders meticulously tracked their progress, sending regular reports to Reich Main Security Office headquarters that used sterile administrative language to categorize each life extinguished as if it were a mere statistic. Yet the operations architects were not unthinking instruments of violence, but educated professionals, jurists, economists, and academics who applied business-like principles to murder. They organized personnel rosters, transportation logistics, ammunition supplies, and grave-digging teams with the same attention to detail they might have devoted to any civilian project. After each campaign, they even held brief gatherings presented as debriefings to reinforce group cohesion and maintain morale. Local auxiliaries played a crucial role in scaling these operations. Auxiliary police and civilian collaborators, motivated by ideological fervor or opportunism, provided intelligence and manpower for arrests, greatly extending the Einsatzgruppen's reach. Their involvement lent a veneer of legitimacy to the massacres, obscuring the central role of German command and making the atrocities seem like localized security measures rather than state-sponsored genocide. By embedding mass murder within both military and civilian administrative frameworks, the Einsatzgruppen achieved an efficiency of destruction unparalleled in history. Their actions during Operation Barbarossa stand as a chilling example of how extremist ideology, when combined with bureaucratic expertise, can dismantle moral constraints and unleash calculated, large-scale atrocity. Overwhelmed by the relentless psychological strain on their shooters, Heinrich Himmler ordered what he termed a humane solution, not out of mercy for the victims, but to spare the mental health of those ordered to kill. The result was the prototype gas van, a sealed cargo vehicle rigged to pump in carbon monoxide while driving. In this mobile chamber, victims were asphyxiated and Musse, inaugurating a grim precursor to the gas chambers later built in extermination camps. After the war, captured Einsatzgruppen barracked. Reports sent to Berlin laid bare the mechanized cruelty in clinical spreadsheets. July, 12,532. August, 35,432. Even the average ammunition expenditure per victim was recorded with chilling precision, plummeting from 12 rounds to 5 or 6. As squads honed their so-called efficiency, such statistics reduced human lives to arbitrary production quotas, transforming genocide into a business model. Photographs of bodies heaped in mass graves, alongside meticulously kept ledgers, testified to the system's utter disregard for human dignity. Yet, amid this bureaucratic inhumanity, a handful of survivors managed to escape. Their harrowing accounts describe the rigid separation of men, women, and children before execution, the removal of clothing under false promises of relocation, and the horrific requirement to witness loved ones led to their deaths. These testimonies exposed the moral corrosion at the heart of the Soviet space liberation machine, as victims were told that murder was both a service to the Reich and a preventive security measure. That ideological machinery, which framed mass extermination as an act of self-defense and communal cleansing, stands as one of the Third Reich's most brutal innovations. By subordinating conscience to administrative edict, the Nazi regime enlisted its most educated professionals to refine the process of murder. Law scholars drafted orders, economists optimized logistics, and academics compiled after-action reports as if summarizing corporate profits. In so doing, they stripped genocide of its horror, presenting it instead as a technical task to be executed with ruthless efficiency. This fusion of extremist ideology and bureaucratic expertise laid bare the depths to which a modern state could descend when intellect and morality were severed. The gas vans and the mass shootings of Operation Barbarossa demonstrated that killing need not be chaotic or raw. When methodically organized, it could become a grim rite of state machinery. The Einsatzgruppen thus emerged not only as agents of mass murder, but as architects of a new, industrialized brutality, one measured in spreadsheets, optimized like factory output, and shielded by the veneer of legal and administrative normalcy. The logistical network of the Einsatzgruppen was exceptionally sophisticated, reflecting the operation's industrial rigor rather than the chaotic brutality one might expect. Each detachment traveled with a fleet that included one truck for executing squads, another for transporting victims, motorcycles for dispatch riders, dedicated radio vehicles for secure communications, and supply trucks loaded with ammunition caches, shovels for grave digging, and even barrels of industrial alcohol for troop rations. Captured documents later revealed that Group C, operating in central Ukraine, maintained an ammunition ledger so precise it recorded monthly expenditures down to the very last cartridge, underscoring the obsessive attention to resource management To amplify their reach, the Einsatzgruppen forged close ties with local auxiliary police forces and civilian volunteers. These auxiliary units, often driven by entrenched prejudice against Jewish communities or a desire to curry favor with the occupying authorities, served as force multipliers. They provided invaluable intelligence on community networks, identified designated targets, and shared in the operational workload. This local collaboration not only conserved German manpower, but also lent a veneer of domestic legitimacy to the killings in villages and towns. Neighbors were compelled to betray neighbors, turning the genocidal process into a communal enterprise cloaked in administrative necessity. Within the ranks of the Einsatzgruppen, a grim culture of professionalization took root. Before each execution, commanders convened technical briefings designed to mitigate the psychological burden on their men. These sessions framed the act of killing as a preventive security measure, a duty performed in self-defense, thereby normalizing murder as an extension of military precaution. New recruits underwent ritualized, hardening ceremonies, intended to steel their nerves against the moral weight of their orders. Following each operation, small victory gatherings were held complete with toasts and rations, celebrating the completion of assigned quotas rather than mourning the lives extinguished. One of the most unsettling legacies of this professional culture was preserved by Sonderkommando 4A, which compiled a so-called visual chronicle. This album, photographed on location like a tourist scrapbook, documented every phase of the killing process: the assembly of victims, the preparation of mass graves, the firing squads in action, and the aftermath of stacked bodies. Far from concealing their deeds, these perpetrators treated them as trophies of efficiency, reinforcing their belief that genocide was a technical achievement worthy of record. When brought before post-war tribunals, members of the Einsatzgruppen described their methods with chilling detachment. They likened executions to shooting ducks, speaking in administrative terms about target acquisition, squad rotation, and ammunition savings. Their testimony laid bare a dehumanization so complete that they no longer perceived victims as fellow human beings, but as data points in a production schedule. This ruthless professionalism directly informed the final solution's later mechanization within concentration camps. The methods honed in the field, meticulous logistics, local collaboration, psychological conditioning, and administrative record-keeping were transposed onto an even larger scale. Gas chambers, crematoria, and conveyor belt processes for registering, stripping, and eliminating prisoners represented the ultimate extension of Einsatzgruppen doctrine. By transforming genocide into an engineered system of destruction, the Nazi regime demonstrated how modern bureaucratic expertise, when divorced from ethical constraints, could unleash atrocities of unprecedented magnitude. In the wake of the Soviet and Allied victory over Nazi Germany, bringing the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen to justice presented an entirely novel legal challenge. The concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity had yet to be codified in international law. To prepare for the trial, officially titled The United States of America versus Otto Ohlendorf et al., which commenced on September 15, 1947, at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, American authorities undertook a comprehensive renovation of the bomb-scarred facility. They installed cutting-edge audio recording systems to capture every spoken word in the courtroom, erected simultaneous translation booths to accommodate 24 interpreters working in concert, and constructed a climate-controlled archive capable of preserving more than 250,000 pages of original evidence. The courtroom itself was reconfigured to meet military exacting standards. Defendants were seated in individual stalls, facing a raised bench occupied by a panel of 3 American judges. Adjacent to the judge's bench, a designated section was reserved for the chief prosecutor and his support staff, with an adjacent gallery for press observers and invited guests behind the scenes. A state-of-the-art communications network linked the courtroom to secure outposts, ensuring that transcripts, exhibits, and real-time translations could be transmitted to analysts and historians beyond the trial's walls. At the helm of the prosecution stood Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who marshaled a multidisciplinary legal team drawn from the Department of Defense's Pentagon, the Department of State, and the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the United States Army. This team meticulously sifted through a vast array of documentary sources, intelligence dossiers assembled by Allied codebreakers, the Einsatzgruppen's own operational reports known as Einsatzgruppenbericht, intercepted personal correspondence between SS officers, and field notebooks maintained by German commanders in the occupied territories. Each document was authenticated, translated, and cataloged, creating an evidentiary matrix that left no room for plausible deniability. Security protocols around the trial rivaled those of a modern head of state summit. Armed military police manned every entrance and exit, conducting identification checks on all who entered. Surveillance cameras monitored the corridors, while specially trained K9 units patrolled perimeters to detect concealed weapons or contraband. The intention was twofold: to protect the integrity of the proceedings from any attempted interference, and to send a clear signal that the international community would not tolerate any obstruction of justice. This meticulous attention to infrastructure served multiple purposes. First, it ensured that the defendants received a fair trial under transparent, rule-based conditions, upholding the highest standards of due process, even for those accused of the gravest offenses. Second, it created a permanent record filmed, transcribed, and archived for future generations. By preserving every shred of evidence and every uttered word, the tribunal established a bulwark against any later attempts to rewrite or deny the historical reality of the Einsatzgruppen's deeds. In doing so, the Nuremberg proceedings not only adjudicated individual guilt, but also laid the groundwork for the post-war legal regime that would define and prosecute genocide and crimes against humanity in the decades to come. Under the newly forged legal framework, the tribunal delineated 3 principal counts. First, crimes against humanity defined as the systematic slaughter of civilian populations. Second, war crimes encompassing the unlawful killing of prisoners of war in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions. And third, membership in a criminal organization. Since the Einsatzgruppen had been formally designated a criminal entity by decree of Adolf Hitler himself, these charges established a comprehensive legal net braider, ensuring that both individual actions and institutional affiliations fell within the court's jurisdiction. Presiding over the proceedings was Chief Judge Michael Musmano, flanked by 2 fellow American jurists. Their task was to reconcile established principles of United States law with the emerging tenets of international justice. While American jurisprudence provided procedural safeguards, such as the right to counsel and protection against self-incrimination, international law demanded recognition of offenses that transcended national borders and wartime exigencies. This dual imperative required Musmano and his colleagues to craft procedural rules that honored due process while affirming that certain crimes, by their very nature, could never be excused by allegiance to any state. Among the tribunal's most progressive innovations was the categorical rejection of the superior order's defense. The court decreed that obedience to orders from superiors could not absolve a defendant when the criminality of those orders was manifestly obvious. In Musmano's words, "A soldier is not an automaton and must be held personally accountable for actions that any reasonable person would recognize as criminal." This landmark ruling undercut the long-standing military doctrine that subordinates bear no guilt when acting under command, establishing a precedent that would resonate in every subsequent prosecution of atrocities. Because eyewitness testimony was scarce, many victims had perished, and few had survived to testify. The prosecution pivoted to documentary evidence generated by the Einsatzgruppen themselves. Meticulously compiled situation reports, daily operational logs, ammunition requisition invoices, and signed orders formed the backbone of the case against the defendants. Over 250 photographs depicting execution sites and mass graves were displayed at trial. Alongside more than 250,000 pages of archival documents confronted with these materials, the accused faced undeniable proof of the very policies they had orchestrated, turning their own records into instruments of justice. This evidentiary strategy, eschewing reliance on live witnesses in favor of perpetrator-generated archives, proved indispensable. It not only filled the gaps left by the absence of survivors, but also pioneered a methodology for prosecuting future acts of genocide and crimes against humanity by demonstrating that documentary trails, when authenticated and contextualized, can withstand the rigors of cross-examination. The trial laid the groundwork for later tribunals in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and beyond. In doing so, it affirmed that when the voices of the victims fall silent, the written record can speak with equal force, ensuring that those who engineer mass atrocities remain forever accountable. The trial unfolded over 136 sessions spanning 7 months, with each hearing charged by the weight of undeniable evidence and high-stakes legal argument. Brigadier General Telford Taylor's opening statement consumed 2 intensive days, during which he unleashed a torrent of documentation. The Einsatzgruppen Bericht reports cataloging victim counts, explicit kill orders annotated in SS commanders' own handwriting, and signed transports of ammunition and personnel. To the courtroom's stunned silence, Taylor projected rare color footage filmed by the Einsatzgruppen themselves. Images that captured the methodical assembly of execution sites and the grim choreography of mass shootings. Confronted by their own records, many defendants withdrew into mute resignation, unable to dispute the facts on display. When the defense was permitted to speak, most defendants invoked the worn refrain of superior orders, claiming they had simply followed directives from above. A smaller contingent offered a variation on this theme, labeling their actions as security measures necessary to forestall guerrilla resistance or the spread of disease. The judges methodically dismantled these arguments, reviewing the court's findings on each individual's level of discretion and the unmistakable criminal nature of the orders they executed. Next, the prosecution meticulously cataloged each category of victims: men, women, children, even infants, who had been lined up at grave's edge under false promises of resettlement. General Taylor invited the tribunal to study detailed transcripts describing the separation of families, the removal of clothing, and the final shots that extinguished entire generations in a single operation. Far from abstract numbers, these accounts underscored the calculated, Systematic nature of the murders. To demonstrate the Wehrmacht's direct involvement, Taylor introduced meeting minutes and communications between German army commanders and Einsatzgruppen officers. Contrary to assertions of spontaneous civilian actions, these documents revealed explicit coordination, military escorts for killing squads, shared intelligence on target locations, and joint logistical planning. Officers who had once claimed ignorance now faced the irrefutable proof of their collaboration with regular armed forces. The tribunal then heard testimony from German witnesses, intelligence officers who supplied reconnaissance data, and local administrators compelled to facilitate victim lists, though limited in number. Their statements carried immense weight, illustrating how Einsatzgruppen officers prepared operations down to the last detail resource allocations, timing strategies, and contingency plans for mobility disruptions. Their insider perspectives shattered any pretense that these acts were unplanned or improvised. A handful of survivors provided the trial's most poignant moments. Their recollections, voiced with measured restraint, described forced undressings, the cold sight of open pits, and the unspoken terror of standing on the precipice of mass graves. These personal narratives, brief yet searing, connected the tribunal's abstract evidence to the lived experience of atrocity. Finally, the prosecution presented forensic findings to cement the case. Pathologists testified on wound patterns consistent with close-range firearm discharges. Soil samples extracted from mass grave sites yielded shell casings uniquely matched to German military ammunition. Ballistics experts confirmed that bullets retrieved from exhumed remains corresponded to the very weapons listed in Einsatzgruppen supply logs. This convergence of documentary, testimonial, and scientific proof left the defendants unable to refute their central role in orchestrating systematic genocide. By the trial's conclusion, the assembly of records, films, witness accounts, and forensic analyses formed an unassailable mosaic of guilt. No longer could Einsatzgruppen members hide behind propaganda or procedural ambiguity. The court's unrelenting scrutiny demonstrated that mass murder, when executed with bureaucratic precision, could still be dismantled piece by piece under the rigorous light of justice. After 2 months of meticulous deliberation, on April 9, 1948, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 14 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, 2 received life imprisonment, and 5 were handed prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. Only Matthias Graf walked free. Evidence showed his efforts to resist criminal orders, and his limited involvement spared him from conviction. This spectrum of sentences reflected the court's commitment to individualized justice rather than collective punishment, ensuring that each man's fate corresponded to his personal degree of responsibility. Among those condemned to death were some of the most notorious architects of mass murder. Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, commander of Group D, who oversaw more than 90,000 executions, stood in the dock alongside Paul Blobel, leader of Sonderkommando 4A and principal orchestrator of the Babenjahr massacre, Ernst Bieberstein. Once a Protestant pastor turned squad commander, faced the gallows for his betrayal of moral and religious vows, Vera Zimmermann, a doctor of law who directed Einsatzkommando 11B in the slaughter of over 11,000 civilians, also received the ultimate sentence. Each name etched in the death warrants symbolized a distinct chapter of calculated atrocity. In the weeks that followed, Several of the death sentences were reduced to lengthy prison terms after appeals. These commutations sprang not from leniency toward the crimes committed, but from careful review of individual actions and evidence. Where doubt remained about a defendant's direct orders or degree of control, sentences were adjusted to reflect a nuanced understanding of guilt. This process underscored the tribunal's principle: punishment must align with personal culpability, even when the collective horror demands justice. This landmark judgment marked a turning point in international criminal law. For the first time, the concept of individual responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity was not merely asserted in theory, but enforced in practice. The tribunal declared unequivocally that membership in a criminal organization and participation in systematic slaughter could no longer be shielded by ranks or orders. Every man, regardless of title or rank, was accountable for choices that violated fundamental human rights. The legacy of these verdicts reverberated far beyond the walls of the Nuremberg courtroom. By affirming that atrocity cannot be bureaucratically compartmentalized or morally outsourced, the decision paved the way for future prosecutions under the principles it established. The notions of command responsibility in crimes against humanity would later be codified in treaties and statutes worldwide. From the Geneva Conventions to the statutes of modern international tribunals, above all, the trial of the Einsatzgruppen commanders confirmed that when a state's machinery is weaponized against its own citizens, each individual operator must answer for his part in the machinery's deadly function. Security was tightened to an unprecedented level as the executions commenced at Landsberg prison from the 7th to the 9th of June. 1951, the Americans converted the very cell block that had once confined Adolf Hitler into a dedicated execution chamber, installing 3 gallows constructed to rigorous military specifications. Each apparatus featured a trapdoor mechanism engineered to ensure a swift fracture of the cervical vertebrae, reflecting a grim attention to procedural precision rather than any display of retribution. Before being led to the scaffold, each condemned man was roused in the early hours, provided with a simple prison-issued uniform, and offered a final meal, typically coffee and a cigarette. They were afforded the presence of a chaplain, with whom they could speak in private. At the appointed moment, military police escorted the prisoner to the gallows. The condemned was hooded, the noose adjusted, and the death sentence solemnly read aloud. At the signal, the trapdoor sprang open, and a United States Army medical officer promptly confirmed the cessation of life. Following each execution, the bodies were not released to families. Instead, they were interred in unmarked mass graves within the prison grounds. A deliberate policy to deny any possibility of neo-Nazi veneration. This burial practice underscored the Allies' resolve to prevent the transformation of execution sites into shrines for extremist sentiment. Armed guards and surveillance teams maintained a tight perimeter throughout the operation, ensuring that no unauthorized presence or demonstration could disrupt the solemn proceedings. News of the executions received muted treatment in Western media. In contrast to the landmark Nuremberg trials, the Landsberg events passed with little fanfare, reflecting a weariness toward ongoing war crimes coverage. Within Germany, public opinion fractured along generational lines. Older citizens, many still influenced by wartime propaganda, dismissed the proceedings as victor's justice, while a younger cohort recognized the sentences as a necessary step toward national reckoning. International reactions ranged from approval to outright condemnation. In the Soviet Union, state-controlled outlets denounced the sentences as insufficient, arguing that summary execution would have better served justice for crimes committed on Soviet soil. Conversely, in Israel and among Jewish communities worldwide, commentary highlighted the precedent set by holding intellectuals and command-level operatives personally accountable. Some praised the reaffirmation of individual liability, while others lamented that even these ultimate penalties could never fully address the magnitude of the atrocities. The 3 days of executions at Landsberg thus closed a grim chapter in the post-war pursuit of accountability. The combination of stringent security, procedural formality, and contested public response illustrated the complex legacy of transitional justice. Though the physical act of carrying out sentences was over, the broader struggle to reconcile legal principle with moral imperatives would continue to shape international jurisprudence for decades to come. The legal architecture forged at the Einsatzgruppen trials laid the cornerstone for every international tribunal that followed. At Nuremberg, judges asserted that high-ranking officers could not evade accountability by claiming mere obedience to orders. This principle of command responsibility holds that military and political leaders are legally liable for atrocities committed by their subordinates when they knew or reasonably should have known what was taking place. This doctrine resurfaced powerfully decades later at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established in 1993, where prosecutors invoked it in the Srebrenica case to convict commanders who had overseen the massacre of more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. Just 1 year later, in 1994, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda applied the same reasoning to prosecute those responsible for the organized slaughter of Tutsi communities, reinforcing command responsibility as a universal norm. When the Rome Statute created the International Criminal Court in 1998, it codified these precedents into Article 33, explicitly restricting the superior order's defense. Rooted in Judge Michael Musmano's dictum, "A soldier is not an automaton," this provision ensures that no individual may hide behind rank or superior's decree when the criminality of the orders is manifest. By embedding this rule in the court's founding treaty, the drafters guaranteed that future defendants could not dodge liability simply by quoting chain-of-command directives. Moreover, the Rome Statute's definitions of the core crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes directly inherit the tripartite structure pioneered at Nuremberg. Crimes against humanity remain defined as widespread or systematic attacks against civilian populations. Genocide retains its characterization as intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, or religious group. And war crimes continue to encompass grave breaches of international humanitarian law. By mirroring these categories, the ICC reaffirmed that the standards set in the 1940s are not relics but living principles, adaptable to new contexts while preserving their foundational clarity. Perhaps equally transformative was the tribunal's embrace of documentary evidence over eyewitness testimony. In the case of the Einsatzgruppen, so many potential witnesses had perished or fled that prosecutors could not rely on oral accounts alone. Instead, they turned to the perpetrator's own archives, the Einsatzgruppenbericht reports, daily operational logs, ammunition, requisitions, and personal correspondence between SS officers. Hundreds of photographs depicting execution sites and stacked bodies were authenticated and presented as exhibits. This methodological shift demonstrated that when human witnesses are silenced, the written and visual record can speak with equal authority. Subsequent tribunals have taken this approach as standard procedure, investigators now scour digitized military orders, intercepted communications, and satellite imagery to reconstruct mass atrocity campaigns. In Rwanda, prosecutors used meticulously hidden documents to trace chains of command. In the former Yugoslavia, they retrieved emails and radio transcripts to confirm siege strategies and detention orders. Even in modern contexts where physical evidence is scant, the principle remains documentary trails. Once authenticated, can fill the void left by absent survivors and ensure that machinery of death cannot operate in secrecy. Through these mechanisms, command responsibility, a robust codification of core crimes, and the primacy of documentary proof, the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen trial endures. It provided not only a legal template, but also a moral imperative that organized mass violence must be met with equally organized systems of justice, lest impunity become the norm and history's darkest chapters repeat themselves. The onset of the Cold War cast a long shadow over the pursuit of justice for Einsatzgruppen commanders. In 1950, United States High Commissioner John J. McCloy issued a directive to review the death sentences and lengthy prison terms handed down to many convicted war criminals. This decision was driven not by compassion for perpetrators, but by geopolitical imperatives. A stable, rearmed West Germany was seen as essential to counter the Soviet threat. As a result, a significant number of death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment, prison terms of 10 to 20 years. And, in some cases, early release was granted so that former officers and soldiers could be recruited for intelligence services and anti-communist initiatives. The impact was immediate and profound. For survivors of Nazi atrocities and Jewish organizations worldwide, the reductions felt like a betrayal, a cynical commodification of justice that belied the scale of the crimes committed. They saw it as a moral abdication. Men who had orchestrated mass murder were now being freed to serve new masters in a different war. Editorials in leading newspapers condemned the move as victor's mercy, arguing that political expediency had trumped accountability. Public protests erupted in major cities, with banners declaring that the memory of the Holocaust was being sacrificed on the altar of Cold War realpolitik. Yet the political calculus in Bonn and Washington was stark. West Germany's integration into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization depended on its capacity to contribute to collective defense. Intelligence agencies, both American and German, eagerly tapped into the expertise of former military and security officers who possessed intimate knowledge of Soviet tactics, networks, and the divided terrain of post-war Europe. Their involvement in counterintelligence operations was deemed vital, even as it stood at odds with the principles of retributive justice established at Nuremberg. This tension between punishment and pragmatism laid bare the complexities of transitional justice. On one hand, commuting sentences helped legitimize the fledgling Federal Republic of Germany as a sovereign partner in the Western Alliance, bolstering its legal standing and fostering reconciliation among former enemies. On the other hand, it fueled accusations that justice could be negotiated like any other commodity, undermining confidence in international law and the promise that state-sponsored mass murder would never go unpunished. For historians and documentarians, this era offers a cautionary tale. Any comprehensive account of the Second World War and its aftermath must grapple with the uneasy compromise between enforcing sentences for crimes against humanity and addressing emergent security realities. The post-war reductions in punishment demonstrate how legal verdicts, however righteous, can be reshaped by strategic interests. They also illustrate the challenge of balancing retributive justice, the imperative to punish wrongdoing, with restorative objectives aimed at rebuilding societies and preventing future conflict. In crafting historical narratives, it is essential to acknowledge that the Cold War's exigencies did not erase the moral clarity of the Nuremberg principles. Instead, they complicated their application. The decision to commute sentences did not negate the guilt of those convicted. Rather, it highlighted the perennial tension between ethical imperatives and political necessity. For viewers seeking to understand the full arc of justice after the Holocaust, this interplay between law and power is as instructive as the courtroom drama itself. Any account of this period that overlooks the Cold War's imprint risks presenting an incomplete picture of how and why the architects of genocide were ultimately brought to book and, in some cases, let go. Since the 1960s, scholarly inquiry into the Einsatzgruppen archives has deepened our understanding of how educated professionals became instruments of mass murder. In 1992, Christopher Browning's landmark study, Ordinary Men, dissected the social and psychological pressures, peer conformity, indoctrination, and incremental obedience that transformed reserve police battalions from law-abiding citizens into execution squads. Browning revealed that ordinary individuals, when subjected to authoritative commands and group dynamics, could perpetrate atrocities on an industrial scale. Just a few years later, in 1996, Daniel Goldhagen's controversial work, Hitler's Willing Executioners, advanced a provocative thesis that ingrained state-sponsored anti-Semitism in German culture, provided the ideological soil in which genocidal impulses flourished. Goldhagen argued that the Einsatzgruppen murders were not merely the product of wartime expediency, but the culmination of a deeply rooted hatred cultivated over decades by examining local newspapers, party pamphlets, and school curricula. He traced how dehumanizing rhetoric laid the groundwork for willing participation in genocide. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 unlocked troves of previously inaccessible evidence. National commissions in Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus undertook systematic exhumations of mass grave sites, uncovering new locations and recalibrating victim estimates well above the original figure of 1.3 million. Archaeological surveys, forensic analyses, and archival research combined to paint a fuller picture of the Einsatzgruppen's reach. The unveiling of local archives in Moscow and Kiev added thousands of pages of official correspondence, operational orders, and internal memos to the historical record. This influx of documentation sparked a new wave of research, shifting focus toward the interplay between central directives and local implementation. Scholars began to map the relationships between Einsatzgruppen detachments and municipal authorities, police forces, and religious institutions. It emerged that auxiliary police units, often recruited from local law enforcement, and paramilitary groups provided critical support in identifying, rounding up, and deporting Jewish and Roma communities. These auxiliary, whether motivated by ingrained prejudice, opportunism, or fear, acted as force multipliers, amplifying the efficiency of German commandos. In many towns, clergy and church officials played ambiguous roles. Some clergy offered sanctuary or protested the roundups. Others colluded by supplying lists of congregants or acquiescing to Nazi demands under duress. Academic studies have scrutinized parish archives and diocesan correspondence to understand how religious authorities either resisted or facilitated the genocidal machinery simultaneously. Historians revisited survivor testimony, cross-referencing memoirs with execution reports to reconstruct precise timelines. These microhistories highlighted the agency of local actors, community informants, mid-level bureaucrats, and ordinary neighbors whose actions either abetted or, in rare instances, impeded the killing operations. By analyzing letters, diaries, and court depositions, researchers charted the moral and administrative complicity that undergirded mass murder today. The cumulative insights from 20th century scholarship underscore one stark conclusion. The Holocaust in the openness of Eastern Europe was not solely a German enterprise, but a complex network of state, local, and individual collaboration. The post-Cold War revelations have enriched our grasp of how genocide operates at multiple levels, from grand strategy to ground-level interactions, reminding us that accountability must encompass every tier of authority. As historians continue to mine archives and integrate new findings, we are compelled to confront the unsettling reality that systematic killing relied as much on bureaucratic cooperation and cultural complicity as it did on firearms and ideology. The process of remembering and commemorating the victims of the Einsatzgruppen unfolded in distinct phases. In the 1950s to 60s, West German society largely skirted direct acknowledgement of the mobile killing squad's atrocities, preferring a generalized narrative of Nazi crimes rather than confronting the specific actions of each unit. It was not until the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem from 1961 to 62 that global attention returned to the mechanics of genocide itself, prompting a reluctant but necessary public reckoning. Eichmann's televised proceedings forced audiences to confront the bureaucratic machinery behind mass murder. And slowly, discourse shifted from abstract culpability to the concrete operations of the death squads. By the closing decades of the 20th century, memorialization efforts gained momentum across Eastern Europe. At Babyn Yar in Ukraine, where tens of thousands were slaughtered in a single operation, a series of monuments rose alongside a dedicated museum and bilingual information panels that traced the site's grim history. In Rumbula, Latvia, local authorities and survivor groups established interpretive trails, engraved stones, and an exhibition center that contextualized the field executions within broader occupation policies. Ponary in Lithuania saw a similar transformation, with a visitor pavilion presenting archival photographs, video testimonies, and scholarly research. Hundreds of these memorials now stand at former execution sites, each one a stark testament to the need for perpetual vigilance against hate. Education systems in Europe and North America gradually incorporated these chapters of the Holocaust into their curricula. History textbooks, once content to summarize the Third Reich's death camps, began including dedicated sections on the Einsatzgruppen's field operations. Lesson plans guided students through analysis of primary documents, operation reports, military orders, and survivor affidavits, enabling a deeper understanding of how genocide unfolded beyond fenced perimeters. University courses on 20th century history and genocide studies offered specialized modules on mobile extermination units, drawing connections between ideological indoctrination, administrative competence, and the collapse of moral boundaries. By embedding these materials in schooling, instructors ensured that future generations would not forget the opening salvo of the final solution. Commemoration extended into the very geography of modern cities. Streets and squares were named in honor of Jewish and Roma victims, transforming everyday urban landscapes into living memorials. In Berlin, a plaza near the former Gestapo headquarters carries the name of a Roma family deported by Einsatzgruppen detachments. In Warsaw, a thoroughfare is dedicated to communities wiped out in the eastern borderlands. These acts of toponymic remembrance serve not only to honor those lost, but also to signal a collective commitment to confront past injustices. Public art installations, sculptural benches, engraved cobblestones, illuminated walls invite passers-by to pause, reflect, and bear witness. Through these evolving practices, initial denial, artistic and architectural commemoration, curricular integration, and civic naming societies have transformed the darkest chapters of Einsatzgruppen history into instruments of memory and moral caution. Each memorial, lesson, and street sign stands as a defiant rebuttal to indifference, reminding us that the machinery of annihilation thrives in silence and inaction. Only by keeping these memories alive, through scholarly rigor and community engagement, can we ensure that never again remains more than an empty promise? More than 3/4 of a century have passed. Yet the tale of the Einsatzgruppen remains a stark warning of how state policy can degrade human life into mere statistics. When producing a World War II history video, give each of the following 8 focal points its due weight. First, the legal framework and the educated commanders highlight how university-trained jurists, economists, and scholars, rather than frontline troops, led the mobile killing squads, show how their professional pedigrees lent bureaucratic legitimacy to genocide, and how the Nuremberg judges treated academic credentials not as exoneration, but as evidence that these men understood the criminal nature of their deeds. Second, the methods of extermination explain technique like sardine packing, whereby victims were shot at close range and stacked in pits to save time, and the introduction of gas vans to spare shooters' mental health emphasize the chilling efficiency documented in administrative reports, monthly tallies of lives extinguished, without dwelling on graphic detail. Third, the transition from mobile killing to concentration camps trace how procedures refined in the field logistics, record keeping, local collaboration were absorbed into camp operations. Note how lessons learned by the Einsatzgruppen informed the design of gas chambers, crematoria, and rail-linked deportation systems, marking the shift from on-the-spot executions to industrialized murder. Fourth, the Nuremberg trials and the birth of modern legal principles cover the U.S. prosecution of Otto Ohlendorf and his co-defendants, emphasizing the 3 counts: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in a criminal organization, and the rejection of superior orders, show how military-grade courtroom infrastructure and meticulous documentation turned field reports into unassailable evidence. Fifth, the legal legacy command responsibility from Nuremberg to the ICC illustrate how the tribunal's dictum that a soldier is not an automaton matured into Article 33 of the Rome Statute, chart the doctrine's application at the ICTY and ICTR, demonstrating how leaders today can be held liable for subordinate atrocities they knew or should have known. Sixth, the post-war political dimension, Cold War and commutations, acknowledge High Commissioner John J. McCloy's 1950 review of sentences under Western political pressure, explain how many executions were commuted to life terms or early release to bolster West Germany against the Soviet Union, and how that compromise provoked protest among survivors, even as it cemented the fledgling republic's place in NATO. Seventh, scholarly research and intellectual legacy. Summarize groundbreaking works like Christopher Browning's analysis of peer pressure in Ordinary Men and Daniel Goldhagen's exploration of ingrained anti-Semitism in Hitler's willing executioners. Note how post-Soviet access to archives in Moscow and Kyiv deepened our understanding of local collaboration and state-to-field relationships. 8. Commemoration and public education. Recommend integrating footage of memorials at Baben Yar, Rumbula, and Ponary, with classroom scenes where students examine primary documents and survivor testimonies. Suggest highlighting street names and plaques across Europe that embed Holocaust memory in everyday life. Reinforcing never again as both lesson and obligation. By weaving together original archival materials, survivor voices, and analytical commentary, your video will balance human stories with the broader political and legal context. Such an approach ensures a presentation that is at once emotionally resonant, historically rigorous, and deeply instructive for future generations. This video offers viewers a dual value it serves, both as a warning about the destructive power of state machinery when justice and ethics are divorced, and as proof of the enduring strength of justice, even in the face of the most horrific crimes. Through each frame, the audience comes to understand that crimes against humanity arise not only from the roar of guns, but also from cold bureaucratic desks. The typed words in administrative reports and the signatures on extermination orders from the story of the Einsatzgruppen. We learn 3 important lessons. First, unchecked power can easily reduce human lives to mere statistics. Only transparency and accountability can prevent that descent. Second, legal systems and the principle of command responsibility are not mere formalities, but guarantees that no one may hide behind superior orders when the criminal nature of those orders is unmistakable. Finally, collective memory and acts of commemoration do more than recall the past. They entrust us with the responsibility to uphold human dignity for future generations. Let this video be more than a history lesson. Let it be a reminder, never remain silent in the face of injustice. And let each of us contribute to safeguarding humanity and righteousness